Union High is taking on its challenges from the north. There have been many changes in South Africa in the past few decades, and nowhere more so than on the sporting field. Rugby used to be the preserve of the country's white minority. Now the passion for the game is shared.
It's a sport that's been played here since the school was established 94 years ago, and the boys love it.
Black students were once prohibited from walking onto these grounds. Now white students are comprehensively outnumbered.
First students to come into the school, the first non-white students to come into a school of this nature, it must have been quite daunting. I think from the perspective of the staff and the learners who would have all been white at that stage, it must have been also a challenge, something completely foreign to them.
When Nelson Mandela won the country's first democratic election, it finally closed the book on 4 decades of white minority apartheid rule. Apartheid, which literally means separateness, divided the country by race. One of its main features was reserving 80% of the land for the white minority. This inevitably led to large numbers of people being forcibly removed from areas they'd lived in for generations. No town or community was exempt. People's lives and the landscape changed forever when the mass forced evictions began.
I was teaching at the time, and for a week I never got back to my old house because I just felt I can't do that. So Liz had to do all the other packing at home and seeing that everything is out onto the lorries and things and just bring it here.
Staunch Anglicans Petronella and Leslie Martin, both school teachers, had no say in where they lived, but they stuck to their church in the centre of town, much to the dismay of a core group of white parishioners.
Actually, I tried to ignore that, because we had to sit at the back of the church, and, that helped me a lot by, not facing everybody.
But it was surprising when they decided to get rid of me, because the church is my first priority. I come there to find my Lord, not to speak to people or find them to criticise my attendance there.
For Reverend John Weldon and his wife Denise, fighting to keep the Martins in the church meant they too paid a price. The congregation asked them to leave town.
It's been a learning curve, I think, for both the congregation and myself, because they're having to get used to new ideas, and I've been able to put in some of my own ideas back into the congregation and finding them responding in a way which they didn't do 30 years ago.
It's only in the past year, after decades away, that the Weldons have also finally come back to Graaff-Reinet, to the same church and the same house where I also lived. 20 years after the end of white racist rule, it begs the question, has this town healed?
To be able to say that coming back again and to see what has happened, growing out of the seed that was sown 30 years ago, and to see that the folk like the Martins and other families like them were prepared to stick at it and have grown with it, has been very heartwarming.
Much has changed since I was last here as a teenage exchange student. It was a challenging and at times confronting year. The state tried to hide much through censorship, but white racist rule was visible to all. The Group Areas Act dictated where people could live. White people in the city centre, black people in a township over that way, and coloureds, as people of mixed race, are still called today in a township that way. Coming back, those barriers are gone, but this is still very much a divided city. Now it's economics keeping people apart.
It's cut out there. That township is called Masizaki.
Mayor Hannah Makoba took over the keys to Graaff-Reinet last year.
There is an increase of change in the town. Our population increased drastically. There are changes even in the schools. There are changes in the community, but not the way it's supposed to be.
Education is the great dividing line and reflects the widest disparity. During the apartheid years, the regime spent 10 times as much on schooling for white children as it did for black children.
As Union High School is grading as a Model C school, where Asheville schools, at the moment, there's no fee schools. So, and most of the children that going to Asheville schools, some of the parents are single parents, some of them have only a one income. So it's definitely a difference between the income. That's why there is so big differences between the schools.
Asheville High School is in Graaff-Reinett's newest and poorest township, originally set up to house people of mixed race called coloureds. Today it's the promise of a free lunch that gets many children through its gate.
We talk about the inside. We talk about what? Yes? The story.
Belinda Borter began teaching at Asheville School during the apartheid era. She returned after decades of living in London a few years ago to a country desperately in need of teachers.
If our country don't have enough teachers, it's all in vain. We'll have a generation that will be illiterate like my mum.
But she says coming home after fleeing racial division is a decision she now regrets. She says South Africa remains a colour-coded nation.
I am shocked in the government that, promised so much. And yet I came back to a situation here that I just want to run out of the school.
Across town, at the once whites-only Union High School, history is being played out. These students are known as the Born Frees. They did not experience apartheid, instead they learn about it. A painful past is now history performed. You should know it's reserved for whites. But in modern-day South Africa, many of the legacies of its divided past remain.
It's one of the harsh realities of this country. If you can pay for it, you can get it. If you can't pay for it, I'm afraid you're struggling.
That continues to be the majority of black and coloured South Africans.